Okay, so I'm going to return to the theme here and pose the question, what again is the crime that Prometheus committed and that the British Empire wants to ensure that we do not commit? Okay, people have here heard that it's stealing fire from the Olympian gods, from Zeus, and giving it to mankind. Now, just on the beginning level, people can think, okay, fire, this is what happens when I have a piece of wood and I rub two pieces of wood together and I get a spark going and get a fire. This is what I need to, at nighttime, have light so that I can see what's around me. This is what I need to be able to kill a deer, to be able to cook it, to be able to digest it. This is what I need at a later period in mankind's history to be able to make certain discoveries. Near this physical fire, you have certain rocks that do strange things when they get in contact with this fire. So on just the superficial level, fire that would seem to be what you need to be able to see what's around you. But in another sense, fire is what you need to see what is the nature of your own mind that allows you to make the discoveries that give you fire in the first place. So I want to go through a couple of things that have been documented by the Rouge-Pack science team in a document called Physical Chemistry, the Gift of Prometheus. I have a few other comments. So this is Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. So this is the kind of thing that could have occurred perhaps 3,000 years before Christ. You have this strange green rock that is happens to be underneath a pile of charcoal, which again itself is a discovery. That originally a fire perhaps was caused by lightning hitting a tree and causing it to turn it into a blaze. And then the question becomes, how do you take what initially is very frightening to you and say, well, maybe this is something that could be useful to us, to be able to take something that happens in nature and to turn it to your benefit. And one of the things that was a major discovery is to realize that much better than simply wood as a fuel is charcoal. And this is something that you can manufacture by setting wood afire and then covering it with dirt so that you allow the fumes to escape, the moisture to escape, and you get a fuel that's much hotter burning than simply wood. And so we have here a picture on the left of what you saw on the previous slide, this green rock, and you have this charcoal on top of it burning. And after a certain period of time, you take the charcoal embers out and you see a reddish orange metal at the bottom of the crucible, and this being copper. And perhaps at a certain point you would have other minerals that would also be present with this green rock that allows you to actually develop metals that are better in terms of the hardness and ability to function as a tool, utensils, potentially weapons, than simply copper, which is somewhat soft, and that is bronze. At a later point, you have certain other kinds of rocks that don't particularly look as if they might have metal in them, like these two rocks here. And a similar sort of thing could have happened where someone was essentially using this charcoal material to attempt to do to what was accomplished with the green rock called malachite with this material, and with charcoal and coal, you actually can produce what's called an iron loom. This is the method that's been used up until perhaps 100 years ago, and you have to physically beat the iron in order to eliminate certain impurities inside the iron. This is what's called wrought iron. But in order to actually make iron a useful material, charcoal is not very functional because it can't get hot enough. Coal burns much hotter, but even coal is not something that is able to be the best fuel for this. In the similar way in which charcoal was made by taking wood and partially burning it under conditions where it doesn't get access to the air, you can take coal and convert it into what's called coke, which has much higher carbon content and burns much hotter. Trying to get in the direction of a certain, as I started before this question of how it is that the Promethean fire is not simply to see what's around you, but in a certain sense to discover the functioning of your own mind in terms of your understanding of how the world around you functions. And a big development in this process occurred in the 18th century with the Antoine Lavoisier, who was a collaborator with the circles around the American Revolution. He did something that had not been done up till that point, which actually was a proposal coming from Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa that perhaps you have heard about a little bit earlier. Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa was born in 1401. Was one of the key minds behind the launching of the Italian Renaissance. The person whose ideas were adopted and his method of thinking was adopted by Johannes Kepler. And what Cusa in one of his writings said is, in order to investigate the world around us, it would be very useful instrument to be able to actually use accurate weighing scales to be able to get an idea of how the universe functions. I don't have the quote right in front of me at the moment, unfortunately. But this is what Lavoisier did, and by doing this, he really took a certain veil off of processes that are occurring in the world around mankind that had not really previously been understood properly. So, for example, Lavoisier would do hundreds and hundreds of different experiments. This green rock you see on the left is the same green rock that we saw previously. It's called malachite. When you burn it with a charcoal fire and under conditions where you don't have a lot of you actually allow this to produce copper. What Lavoisier did is he heated malachite in a glass container, this swan-necked flask, and then in the course of the heating, this green rock turned into a black rock or black powder, and he noticed that it was also giving off a gas, which he could measure because the volume of the gas in this dome container was changing. And what he was able to do with applying very accurate weighing scales, he was able to demonstrate that the weight of the gas that was emitted when you heated malachite, plus the weight of this black powder that he got, equaled the weight of the green malachite which he started from. Now this was extremely important in terms of the development of man's understanding of the world around him. This is what has been referred to since as the idea that that in chemical reactions, chemical transformations such as this is, the mass is conserved. You don't simply lose mass. It doesn't simply disappear, which was not at all obvious, because when these kind of chemical transformations were being done, people would heat a rock, you'd get something different, and then if you're producing a gas, it goes up into the atmosphere, and people think, well, if you were using weighing scales, you would say, well, look, it disappeared. And how do you explain that? So you would have all kinds of crazy ideas to try to explain something that you can't explain unless you have a more systematic approach to it. So this was a major breakthrough, and what Lavoisier did is he basically defined this idea, which was not new to him per se, but he defined this idea of what is elementary, or what was called a chemical element. And he basically said, if you take a certain material and you subject it to a certain process, like this process here, that you have this green rock, you heat it, and all of a sudden it turns into something different, and you can demonstrate that it has lost something, it's lost a gas, you would say, well, this black powder is more elementary than what I started with. Perhaps I could take this black powder, and by adding this gas that has escaped, get back to what I started from. So that in order to understand the processes in the universe around us, it was looking for this idea of what's elementary in terms of processes. So he would say that if you take this black powder and you try to heat that up, or subject it to all kinds of other processes that you might try to consider to break it up into smaller material to get it to lose weight and create and transform into something different, a pair of different materials. And if you can't do that with your existing technologies available to you, for you, that material would be an element. And for example, up until the time of Lavoisier, water was considered an element. And people probably heard that at the time of Aristotle, there were the four elements: air, fire, water, earth. So by the time of Lavoisier, Lavoisier was able to take water, and by dissolving certain salts in it, and then passing electrical current through the water, he was able to break the water down into the oxygen and hydrogen. And there was also another experiment he did in terms of through passing water vapor over a very hot metal, could have been iron, I don't know the details of the experiment, to do the same sort of thing. So that Lavoisier discovered that what people had thought was elementary, and elementary being, okay, if I want to understand how the universe functions, I have to know what causes the universe to function the way that it is. This is what's supposed to be elementary about it. So all of a sudden, what people had thought was elementary is no longer elementary. So all of a sudden, water is not elementary anymore. Also, air, between Lavoisier, who had done various experiments, again, with using this technique of using very accurate scales, his investigations weren't simply confined to inorganic materials, minerals, and so forth. He would take, for example, human beings, put them on one pan of a very large, accurate balance, and then you would give the person food, and then you measure what happened in terms of the gases that the person gives off, what comes out in terms of excrement and so forth, and to get an idea of what actually is happening in terms of these chemical transformations. Or he would take a bell jar similar to this dome-shaped material, filled with air, and then put a lighted candle inside it. And after a certain period of time, the candle would go out. Okay, and then the question is, what has happened? And he actually would do the experiment in an apparatus similar to this, where if you have water inside this covered bell jar, he would notice that the volume of the gas had also changed. so what's going on? So he would say that there are different kinds of air. You know, there's one kind of air and a different kind of air because they have different chemical properties. And it wasn't Lavoisier himself, it was actually Joseph Priestley, who was a collaborator of Benjamin Franklin, involved in the networks of the American Revolution, who actually named and discovered the element of oxygen in the content of air. So around the time of Lavoisier, also people that came later than Lavoisier, a guy named Joseph Proust, which I don't know a whole lot about in terms of his background, had also said that these kind of experiments that Lavoisier was doing, in terms of you take one material, you heat it, you get something else plus a gas. Not only can you take the material that you get plus the gas, and the weight of those two materials adds up to what you started with, Proust discovered that there are certain proportions by which these transformations occur. Okay, that you get in terms of if you go by a weight ratio. For example, if you take water and you turn it into water vapor and pass it over hot iron filings, and you cause the breaking down of water. You get essentially through an experiment you get two different kinds of gas, and one of them a flammable gas, which at that time he also named as hydrogen, and another gas named oxygen. And by weighing these two, he could discover that there was always, and this is what this person Prout later investigated, there was always a constant ratio between the weights of these two materials for simple substances. For example, he would look at what we know today as carbon dioxide. Okay, and you would always have two weights of oxygen to one weight of carbon. Okay, but there was also a different form that you could have an oxidized carbon, where you would only have a 1-to-1 ratio. So you had these kind of investigations into what is elementary in a certain sense in terms of how the universe around us functions. Now, a change in the, and just before I get to Mendeleiev, Lavoisier's idea of what an element is, just to state it and then to contrast it with what Mendeleiev said, is for Lavoisier, if you take a substance, like we were looking at before, this green rock malachite, and if you subject it to a process where you get it to break down to something different, like this black powder that we had, and you take that and you subject that to heating or many different other processes you can subject it to, and you can't do anything to it to cause it to turn into something different or to break down into something more elementary, then for you that material is an element. And Lavoisier said that there's this idea of the principle underlying the elementary substance. Well, he wasn't really as specific as Mendeleiev became, because at a later point, he would have had more work done in this kind of area. And again, this is getting back to what I was referring to at the beginning, in terms of the fire of Prometheus is not simply to see what's around you in some sort of sense that, okay, our knowledge of the universe is based on sense perception. If we can see certain things, if we can touch them, if we can feel them, if we can collect all of this data based on sense perception, then that supposedly is supposed to give us an idea of how the universe works. But no, that's not how mankind has actually progressed. And with Mendeleiev, you see a very interesting reflection of this in terms of, and Mendeleiev himself is interesting. I don't have his whole biography on my fingertips at the moment, but he was someone who was very much interested in the battle inside the United States around the American system. For example, in 1876, 100 years after the Declaration of Independence in the United States, about period after the American Civil War, you had a huge industrial exposition in Philadelphia. And you had a display of machinery, electrical devices, all kinds of scientific experiments, not only from the United States, but from Canada, from France, from Paris. People were bringing all this material to Philadelphia in terms of celebrating the fact that you have a nation, the United States of America, created as a republic, where this ability to use the fire of Prometheus is basically the basis on which the nation was founded. And at the time of the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin, who in one sense is one of the founding fathers of the United States, although he was never president, he was referred to as the American Prometheus. He was doing many experiments, for example, in electricity. As people know, the experiment that Franklin did with a kite, and you have a string that the kite's attached to, and you have electrical light bulb that hits the kite, and he is able to electrify a key, and then essentially demonstrate that these processes occurring in the atmosphere, in areas you can't physically touch, are processes that he could replicate by essentially static electricity. These kind of things have a certain sense of what's going on. So you had Mendeleiev from this standpoint who went to the celebration, went to the exposition in Philadelphia, 1876. He came back to Russia, very excited to actually do this in Russia. He was involved in doing the networks that, with help from the United States, later built the Trans-Siberian Railroad. He was involved in a lot of mineral exploration across Russia, get a sense of what Russia had in terms of mineral resources, what it had in terms of potential oil discoveries. He was therefore concerned from that standpoint to get a better sense of how the world functions from this standpoint that we've been talking about. So his conception of what is elementary in the sense we've been talking about is a little bit interesting, because he said that not simply as Lavoisier had said, that if you take a material, you heat it up, you do anything you can do to it, and you can't get it to decompose into something else, therefore that's what we call an element. What Mendeleiev said is that a chemical element is a certain kind of individual, and it has the question of being an element or being elementary is related to the power of the element to undergo transformations. And for example, he said, take for example charcoal. Okay, as far as Lavoisier was concerned, charcoal is an element. If you go to your high school classroom today, you see the big letter C in this periodic table of Mendeleiev, and you say carbon, that's charcoal, right? So, is charcoal an element, a chemical element? Well, what about diamond? Diamond also contains carbon, but if you look at a diamond and you look at a lump of charcoal, their properties are totally different. Okay, you measure one of them, you can see through, it's transparent. The other one is black. Okay, the density, the physical properties, everything that your senses present to you wouldn't allow you to say, why in your mind could you say, okay, this is what I call a chemical element, and this other thing is also a chemical element, but your senses say these things are not the same thing. Okay? So he was, in a certain sense, taking it beyond even farther than Lavoisier had done before in terms of what is this question of what is elementary in the world. And he also, beyond that, he said that what's elementary in the sense of what we've been talking about, in a certain sense, the shadow of the activity that's demonstrated by one of these chemical elements, whether it be carbon, whether it be oxygen, they're not arbitrary. Okay, that you don't have whole bunch of different chemical elements all having their different properties with no connection of one to the other. You actually have a harmonic organization of these principles that underlie what we call matter. And this is what's reflected in what people know today of as the periodic table of the elements. There's a certain harmonic characteristic of periodicity in the properties of this material, of these substances. So one of the students that Mendeleiev had, I'm going to get to now, is a guy named Vladimir Vernadsky, who Mr. LaRouche has placed a lot of emphasis on the importance of him, of his work. And Vernadsky, he was a student of Mendeleiev. He did also work with a soil scientist in Russia who had done work that looking at soils, okay, and this person's name slips my mind at the moment, but this person basically said, if you look at soil, you can't define it from the standpoint of the principles of the non-living universe. It's not like, you know, iron ore, or there's no way that you can define what soil is from that kind of standpoint, because it does have certain non-living aspect, but it also has life and the results of life within it. And he defined it as a certain category of matter. So what Vernadsky began to do is to look at this question of what's elementary in the universe from a bit broader standpoint than any of the chemists had done so far. Because for them, in a certain sense, they're looking at the world in a certain sense objectively and saying, okay, I've got my balance, I've got my instruments, I'm going to measure the universe around me through these instruments and get a sense of what's elementary from that standpoint. But what Vernadsky basically said was, okay, well, what you're looking at, actually, the surface of the Earth, the crust of the Earth, and the atmosphere, all of this has been radically transformed, not by chemical processes in terms of the non-living part of the world, but in terms of living processes. And this term, the biosphere, is not a term that Vernadsky came up with on his own, but he's the person that actually gave it a rigorous meaning. And it's important to understand that this person whose ideas are in Mr. LaRouche's mind, extremely important to make the fundamental shift in the world in the directions we require. He has been under a huge attack by the oligarchy who are trying to prevent his ideas from being understood, trying to pervert it into a different kind of direction. You say, okay, how do you get an idea of what this is? You know, are we going to start and say, let's define what life is? But he says you can't do that. Okay, there's no way you can arbitrarily say I've got a definition for what life is. What he did is something different. He said, look at all of the matter of the Earth. Some of it is non-living, like rocks and so forth. And other matter is what he called living matter, which is the ensemble of all the possible living organisms on the Earth. And he said something that, you know, on a certain level, you would say, okay, you look at the kind of processes that occur on the Earth, volcanoes, earthquakes, you know, tidal waves, what have you. These seem to, in the moment, be much more powerful than life. But Vernadsky said that over the geological time frame, what's more powerful is actually life, because life has totally transformed the nature of the Earth. And he said, in order to understand this nature of what life is, the biologist will look at an organism from the standpoint of, okay, I can describe what the organism looks like to me. It has a head, it has, you know, 2 arms, it has 2 legs, what have you, and make various measurements based on that. But as Vernadsky said, it is that you have to look at it from a different non-sense perception basis in order to understand what the biosphere is. Because for Vernadsky, the biosphere is not some big sphere with a whole bunch of objects in it, you know, inorganic or organic. It's how do you comprehend as a unified process the domain of life as a unified whole, just as you can't comprehend Beethoven's Ninth Symphony as a whole jumble of musical notes arranged in a certain particular order. It's, you know, what's the unified conception, the unified process which is underlying the biosphere. And so he referred to two principles that characterize the biosphere. First off, he says there's no living organism, including man, that exists simply inside his own skin. Okay? In a certain sense, he said that the living organisms are like the vortex of a process where you have a continual inflow of atoms into the living organism, what he called biogenic migration of atoms, through eating, through a respiration, through excreting, and so forth, for animals, and that the animal cannot exist outside of that. Then the other thing he said is that, you know, over the known history of the biosphere, we know that there has been an evolution of life forms. You know, 65 million years ago, you had the age of the dinosaurs, and then you had certain cataclysmic changes we don't fully understand, and the dinosaurs went extinct, and a different form of life emerged, the mammals, but not just the mammals. At the same time, you had other plant forms that emerged with the mammals. For example, previously to the mammals as the dominant species, you did not have fruit-bearing plants. That emerged with the emergence of the mammals, which is an interesting question. You know, so the question being, if you look at the biosphere, as I was saying before, in one sense, what Mendeleiev was talking about in terms of the chemical element, that look at one element, can it just have any arbitrary properties it wants? No. Its properties are determined by the underlying harmonic organization of the universe. Similarly, with the biosphere, in terms of the evolution of the biosphere, the animals that exist within the biosphere are sort of harmonically tuned for what has to exist for the biosphere to exist as a unified process. And Vernadsky said that the evolution is not something that occurs in the sense of Charles Darwin. You get a mutation and some random event, and you get some freak accident, all of a sudden something changes. But there's a directionality to the evolution of the biosphere towards the purpose of constantly increasing the rate of this biogenic migration of atoms. Okay? And in that process, you have these extinction at various points, mass extinction of species, like the dinosaurs go extinct, many other species go extinct. The entire biosphere is transformed in a radical way. New species emerge that had not existed before, and you have the characteristic that the new species have a much superior capability of being part of this biosphere that has an increased flow of biogenic migration of atoms. So if you look at that, and there are other things that the Rouchpak team has looked at in the past that people were interested to look up. For example, the idea that the evolution of the biosphere is something that happens as a coherent process. It's almost as if the biosphere as a whole had a mind determining what does our future have to look like. Okay? Now, what happens when you have mankind? What happens within the biosphere through the evolution from the dinosaurs to the mammals to this whole upshift of the entire array, instead in human society, there's no necessity for human beings to go extinct. You know, functionally, the way that mankind has advanced is that what's gone extinct are certain classes of ideas that all of a sudden are found to not correspond to reality. This is what happens when you make discoveries, which is the kind of discoveries we were talking about before. And in contrast to what you had previously with this biogenic migration of atoms for animals within the biosphere, you have something different with human beings. You know, we do have to do what animals have to do in terms of, you know, eating, you know, the respiration, and so forth. But in terms of this idea of a migration of atoms that I think Vernadsky would call a noogenic migration of atoms. In other words, it's a movement of material based on mind. Most of this for the human species does not concern going through our bodies. If you think about it, We cannot exist as a species without, for example, one aspect of neogenic migration is, how do we get the coal to the power plant to generate electricity? Or if we happen to have nuclear power plants, how do you get the uranium to the nuclear power plant to generate electricity? How do you get water from one place where there might be too much of it to another area which is arid so that you can grow the food required to feed the population? So instead of sort of looking at how society is operating from the standpoint of, I'm just inside my own skin, I have to just concerned about what's immediately around me as if I were an animal, the functioning of human society is defined from this higher standpoint that in effect this process of noogenic migration of atoms that encompasses, essentially, it's a redefining of how the biosphere works. That's what human beings are involved in shaping and developing. So that's basically what I wanted to go through. I mean, and the other point maybe being is that Vernadsky made the point that for any animal within the biosphere, there is a certain power of a species to extend its domain of activity. For example, bacteria will given sufficient food, they will replicate themselves very rapidly and spread across the oceans if nothing is there to stop them. But they're confined to the biosphere. Vernadsky made the point is there's no reason for the human species to be confined to this planet, because we have the ability to actually redefine the biosphere as encompassing the solar system, which is we're sort of just on the edge of that era. And I think this is what Mr. LaRouche in particular and his science research team are emphasizing. This is what we have to look at in terms of what we have to comprehend in terms of this is the nature of mankind that we have to understand if we're going to defeat Zeus, because anyone, like at the time of the Italian Renaissance, you had the Venetian oligarchy who was faced with a real problem. Up until the Italian Renaissance, you had Aristotle, who was basically the Zeus of the time, saying, okay, we're going to control the way that people think so that they don't think in a way so that they can't make scientific discoveries. But once the Italian Renaissance occurred, you had a problem for that faction within the oligarchy. They say, well, if we do that to our societies, and you have this Italian Renaissance representing a totally different power of the human species, they're going to take over, and we're going to disappear, which is sort of, I think, what we're looking at with this phenomenon around the BRICS and the current phenomenon around the British Empire. Embers out, and you see a reddish orange metal at the bottom of the crucible, and this being copper. And perhaps at a certain point you would have other minerals that would also be present with this green rock that allows you to actually develop metals that are better in terms of the hardness and ability to function as a tool, utensils, potentially weapons, than simply copper, which is somewhat soft, and that is bronze. At a later point, you have certain other kinds of rocks that don't particularly look as if they might have metal in them, like these two rocks here. And a similar sort of thing could have happened where someone was essentially using this charcoal material to attempt to do to what was accomplished with the green rock called malachite with this material, and discovery that originally a fire perhaps was caused by lightning hitting a tree and causing it to turn it into a blaze. And then the question becomes, how do you take what initially is very frightening to you and say, well, maybe this is something that could be useful to us, to be able to take something that happens in nature and to turn it to your benefit. And one of the things that was a major discovery is to realize that much better than simply wood as a fuel is charcoal. And this is something that you can manufacture by setting wood afire and then covering it with dirt so that you allow the fumes to escape, the moisture to escape, and you get a fuel that's much hotter burning than simply wood. And so we have here a picture on the left of what you saw on the previous slide, this green rock, and you have this charcoal on top of it burning. And after a certain period of time, you take the charcoal contact with this fire. So on just the superficial level, fire that would seem to be what you need to be able to see what's around you. But in another sense, fire is what you need to see what is the nature of your own mind that allows you to make the discoveries that give you fire in the first place. So I want to go through a couple of things that have been documented by the Rougepac science team in a document called Physical Chemistry, The Gift of Prometheus. I have a few other comments. So this is Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. So this is the kind of thing that could have occurred perhaps 3,000 years before Christ. You have this strange green rock that is happens to be underneath a pile of charcoal, which again itself is a okay. So I'm going to return to the theme here and pose the question: what again is the crime that Prometheus committed, and that the British Empire wants to ensure that we do not commit? Okay, people have heard that it's stealing fire from the Olympian gods, from Zeus, and giving it to mankind. Now, just on the beginning level, people can think, okay, fire, this is what happens when I have a piece of wood, and I rub two pieces of wood together, and I get a spark going, I get a fire. This is what I need to, at nighttime, have light so that I can see what's around me. This is what I need to be able to kill a deer, to be able to cook it, to be able to digest it. This is what I need at a later period in mankind's history to be able to make certain discoveries. That, near this physical fire, you have certain rocks that do strange things when they get in with charcoal and coal. You actually can produce what's called an iron loom. This is the method that's been used up until perhaps 100 years ago. And you have to physically beat the iron in order to eliminate certain impurities inside the iron. This is what's called wrought iron. But in order to actually make iron a useful material, charcoal is not very functional because it can't get hot enough. Coal burns much hotter, but even coal is not something that is able to be the best fuel for this. In a similar way in which charcoal was made by taking wood and partially burning it under conditions where it doesn't get access to the air. You can take coal and convert it into what's called coke, which has much higher carbon content in it and burns much hotter. So